The smell of jasmine perfume still makes my stomach turn. It clung to Mark's jacket the night he came home late from what he called a client dinner. I knew that scent well. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't subtle. He tossed his blazer carelessly over the back of the chair, unaware that I was sitting in the dim light of the living room waiting for him. His smile was too quick, his voice too smooth, as if rehearsed on the way inside. When I asked how the evening went, he launched into a story about steak and wine, but every detail sounded like lines delivered on a stage. My chest tightened as I leaned closer, inhaling the perfume once more, the invisible guest still clinging to him. Before I go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever caught a whiff of something, a trace of evidence so faint, yet undeniable, that it unraveled your entire sense of safety? If you know what I mean, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories. My name is Elena Brooks, and for most of my life, I believed I was steady, grounded, and blessed. I built a quiet career as a high school counselor, guiding students through heartbreaks and choices, all the while leaning on the kind of family life I thought was unshakable. My husband Mark had always been the ambitious one, climbing his way through regional sales, collecting suits and long hours like trophies. We met in our 20s when neither of us had much, me with my counseling degree just beginning, him working odd jobs before landing his first real position. We were partners in the truest sense, scraping and saving, promising each other we would never let the world make us cold. Our daughter Lily was the glue that held us bright-eyed and fierce, always reminding me of the warmth I thought would last forever. Family meant everything to me. Maybe because mine had been fractured early. I was raised by my mother alone, watching her stretch paychecks across weeks, never once complaining, though the lines on her face deepened every year. Stability was all I ever wanted, and Mark gave the appearance of it, the house in the suburbs, the vacations we posted pictures from, the family dinners where laughter carried over the clinking of glasses. On the surface, it looked like harmony, and for a long time, I believed it was. Tessa, my best friend since college, was always part of that picture too, helping plan birthdays, organizing school fundraisers, sitting across from us at Thanksgiving. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said she was as close to family as anyone could be. But life has a way of testing what you believe. Mark's career started demanding more travel, more dinners, more excuses about late nights spent networking. At first, I accepted it, reminding myself that ambition was part of who he was. Yet sometimes, when he slipped into bed after midnight, I noticed how carefully he avoided my eyes. I ignored the unease, pushing it down, the way women often do, convincing myself it was exhaustion, not distance. Still, the perfume on his jacket that night felt like a splinter under my skin, sharp enough that no amount of denial could dull it. And what unsettled me most was that the scent was familiar, not a stranger's, but one I had breathed in countless times before. I poured myself a glass of water and sat there, staring at the ice swirling inside. Mark moved through the kitchen with the ease of a man convinced of his own innocence. His phone buzzed on the counter screen, lighting up for half a second before he flipped it over with practiced speed. I said nothing. Years of counseling had taught me patience, how silence can reveal more than words. My heart hammered, though, because I already feared the truth that betrayal wasn't coming from the shadows of some nameless woman. It might be walking straight out of the life I thought was safe. And in that quiet, with the perfume still heavy in the air, I realized something. My marriage, my friendships, maybe even my own sense of belonging, were not as unshakable as I once believed. What I didn't know that night was how deep the fracture ran and how much it would cost to finally uncover it. The weeks that followed the night of the perfume were filled with small discoveries that pricked like needles. None of them were loud enough to prove betrayal on their own, but together they formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. Mark began changing his routines in ways that didn't make sense. He had always been a man who hated mornings dragging his feet for coffee before leaving for the office. Yet suddenly, he was out of the house before dawn on supposed client calls. When I asked about these meetings, he waved me off with the impatience of someone who didn't want to be pressed. His shirts carried faint traces of perfume that did not belong to me, sometimes floral, sometimes musky, as if he couldn't remember which story he had already told. Tessa, too, had grown strangely distant. For years, she had been the first to text about a new recipe or a neighborhood update. Lately, her replies were short and delayed excuses stacked on top of excuses whenever I suggested meeting for lunch. At the same time, she appeared more often than ever at gatherings where Mark was present. I started noticing them standing close together, her hand on his arm, as they laughed at some private joke, her eyes sliding away the second she realized I was watching. Each glance lingered like smoke, impossible to catch, but heavy enough to choke me. One evening, Joanne Grant invited several of us for a casual dinner at her house. She was Tessa's aunt, a woman known for her hospitality and her constant stream of neighborhood gossip. Her table was always laid out with more food than anyone could finish. And that night was no exception. Platters of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and peach cobbler filled every corner. I tried to sink into the comfort of conversation, but my focus kept drifting toward the end of the table where Mark and Tessa sat side by side. They leaned close. Their voices lowered their laughter, spilling out in bursts that felt too familiar. When Joanne asked me if I wanted more cobbler, I realized I hadn't touched the plate in front of me. My stomach had tightened into a knot I couldn't untangle. After dinner, while guests gathered in the living room, I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath. That was when I heard the low murmur of voices around the corner. Mark's tone was light, almost teasing, while Tessa's was softer, the kind of tone she had once used with me during long nights of shared secrets. I froze, pressing myself against the wall, as their words drifted toward me. "We have to be careful," Tessa whispered. "She notices everything." Mark chuckled under his breath. "She won't see what she doesn't want to see." My hand shook against the wallpaper. In that instant, the doubt I had been trying to smother hardened into something undeniable. At home, later that night, I stood in the kitchen while Mark poured himself a glass of bourbon. He asked about Lily's college applications as though nothing had happened, his face smooth, his tone casual. I studied him closely, searching for any flicker of guilt. When I finally asked how long he had known about Tessa's new event contracts, he faltered just long enough for me to notice before answering smoothly. "She mentioned them at dinner." I nodded, but inside, I felt something collapse. It wasn't the words themselves, but the ease with which he lied, as if he had been practicing for weeks. I tried to carry on with my days, focusing on work and on Lily's final year of high school, yet everything felt fragile. At the grocery store, I found myself wondering if neighbors could see through me if they whispered when I turned away. During staff meetings, I caught my mind wandering, replaying fragments of overheard conversation, Tessa's hand brushing Mark's sleeve, the sound of their shared laughter. Nights were worse. I would lie awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the miles of silence between us. More than once, I pressed my palm against the empty half of the bed after he slipped out for another early meeting, the sheets cooling too quickly against my skin. Lily, perceptive as always, began asking questions. "Mom, are you okay? You've seemed sad lately." I told her I was fine, that the new semester had been stressful, but I knew she didn't believe me. She watched me with eyes too old for her age, as if she was beginning to understand that adulthood came with secrets children were never meant to carry. I wanted to protect her from the truth, to shield her from the cracks forming in the home we had built together. Still, I could feel the weight pressing heavier each day, threatening to expose itself whether I was ready or not. The first undeniable break came one Saturday afternoon. Mark had claimed he was at a business luncheon, but while driving through town, I saw his car parked outside a small cafe. Through the glass, I caught a glimpse of him seated across from Tessa, their heads bent close, her hand resting on his wrist. They looked up just as I slowed at the light, but neither moved quickly enough to disguise what I had already seen. The light changed, and I drove on, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't stop, didn't confront them then, but inside, something shifted. Denial was no longer possible. That night, as I folded laundry in the quiet of our bedroom, I stared at the neat stacks of shirts and socks, the small rituals that had once defined comfort and routine. They felt hollow now, like props in a play I no longer believed in. Mark moved about the house as if nothing had changed, but I carried the image of that cafe table with me into every corner. It followed me into sleep, into dreams that broke apart, into restless fragments. I knew with a certainty that burned in my chest that the harmony I had clung to was gone. And yet I remained silent. The timing wasn't right. The proof wasn't enough. The fear of tearing my family apart was too heavy. Still, deep down, I sensed it was only a matter of time before silence would no longer protect me. The cracks had widened into something visible, something sharp, and I was left standing on unsteady ground, waiting for the moment when everything would finally give way. The image of Mark and Tessa at that cafe would not leave me. It pressed into my thoughts at odd hours, surfacing while I sorted files at work or listened to a student pour out their heart in my office. Nights were the worst. I would lie in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, remembering how she had leaned across the table, her fingers brushing his wrist. The small act played on repeat in my mind, cutting deeper each time, until it no longer seemed like imagination, but proof etched into memory. I tried to mask the heaviness from Lily, but children sense more than parents wish to admit. She began hovering in quiet ways, offering to do the dishes, sitting close on the couch when she knew I was tired. One evening, she asked gently if Dad and I were fighting. I told her no, brushing her hair back and forcing a smile, yet I could see the doubt in her eyes. The weight of keeping her shielded made my chest ache, but I wasn't ready to speak the truth aloud, not even to myself. At school, I found myself staring at my reflection in the faculty restroom mirror. The woman looking back seemed older, not because of years, but because of exhaustion. My face carried shadows of worry, my shoulders slumped with secrets I had no words for. I remembered the promise Mark and I had once made, that we would always protect one another from loneliness. Now I felt lonelier with him in the room than I ever had when he was away. The strain grew heavier when Walter came by one Sunday afternoon. He had always been fond of me, often praising my steadiness and telling me how much Lily reminded him of his late wife. That day he brought over a box of tools, insisting something needed tightening on our back deck. As he worked, he talked about how proud he was that Mark had good friends like Tessa who looked after him during long weeks of travel. His words stung, though he meant no harm. I stirred a pot of soup inside the kitchen, listening to his voice through the open door, and my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the spoon. Even simple gatherings became strained performances. At Joanne's next dinner, I noticed how people's eyes followed Mark and Tessa when they moved about the room. Nothing was said yet. Silence often tells its own story. I laughed at jokes I didn't hear, tasted food I couldn't swallow, and pretended not to see the small, knowing looks that flickered among the guests. Every gesture between the two of them felt louder now, his hand guiding her through a doorway, her smile angled just for him. It was a play they performed in plain sight, trusting that politeness would keep the audience from speaking. Late one evening, when Mark claimed another business call, I picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. The faint trace of jasmine perfume still lingered there, blending with the smell of his cologne. My fingers clenched the fabric as though I could squeeze the truth out of it. For a long moment, I stood frozen, then folded the jacket neatly as if nothing had happened. The act felt like a betrayal against myself, a quiet agreement to pretend, yet I carried on. Sleep grew thin, broken by dreams that left me restless. In them, I walked through crowded rooms, searching for familiar faces. Yet whenever I turned, the people I loved stood with their backs to me, laughing at something I couldn't hear. I would wake, with my heart pounding, reaching for air in the dark. Beside me, Mark slept peacefully, unaware of the storms he had set inside my chest. The loneliness became heavier than anger. At work, I guided students through their small heartbreaks, reminding them that healing came in time, all while hiding the raw wound inside my own life. At home, I washed dishes and folded laundry as though routine could shield me. Even conversations with Lily felt fragile, each word chosen carefully to protect her from cracks I feared would soon split wide open. One night, I found myself sitting in the driveway long after I had pulled in from work. The porch light glowed softly, shadows stretching across the yard, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I watched the windows of my own house, seeing the silhouette of Mark moving across the living room phone pressed to his ear. His posture was relaxed, his head tilted in a way I recognized as listening closely. My chest tightened. That small gesture, once reserved for me, now belonged to someone else. I finally stepped inside, greeted with a quick nod, as he slipped past toward the kitchen. He poured himself a drink without looking at me, muttering about a long day. I stood in the doorway, watching the rhythm of his movements, the familiar and the foreign, blending into one. My voice caught before I could ask anything, so I turned away. My silence another brick in the wall growing between us. It became clear that the life I thought I knew was unraveling thread by thread, each small discovery tugging at the fabric until the pattern no longer held. I had once believed in our vows in the years of trust we built, yet now, every glance and every silence felt weighted with secrets. The truth had not fully surfaced, but I could feel it rising, pressing against the edges of my carefully guarded world. And as much as I tried to deny it, I knew that silence could not protect me forever. Something had shifted too deeply, and sooner or later, the truth would break through, no matter how tightly I tried to hold it back. The breaking point arrived on an evening that should have been ordinary. I was clearing the dinner table when Mark's phone buzzed on the counter. He was upstairs, and though I never touched his things, the screen lit up with a name I knew too well, Tessa. The message preview appeared bold against the glass, "Tomorrow works." Same place? My hands froze mid-motion, the plates trembling in my grip. I stood staring at those words until the screen dimmed to black. When Mark came back down, whistling lightly as if nothing in the world weighed on him, I placed the plates in the sink and forced myself to move casually. I asked how his day had been, and he launched into a story about travel expenses, never noticing the stiffness in my tone. I nodded and smiled at the right places, but every word he spoke felt hollow. Inside, the quiet denial I had been clinging to for months began to unravel. The next day at work, I sat in my office, unable to focus. Students came and went, their voices blurring in my ears. Marcy, a counselor I'd known for years, knocked gently on my door near lunchtime. "You look pale, Elena," she said, her voice filled with concern. I hesitated, then told her I wasn't sleeping well. She studied me for a long moment, then closed the door. You've carried everyone else's secrets for years. Maybe it's time you let someone hold yours. Her words broke something in me. I didn't tell her everything, but enough slipped out for her to reach across my desk and squeeze my hand. That evening, while Mark claimed another late meeting, I drove across town and parked outside the cafe where I had seen him with Tessa weeks before. My heart pounded as I sat in the car, headlights off, watching through the glass windows. Just after 7, they appeared. Mark in his dark blazer, Tessa in a pale blue dress I had once helped her choose for another occasion entirely. They sat close, leaning into each other, their faces lit with the kind of ease that comes only from familiarity. I sat motionless, the steering wheel cold under my hands until my vision blurred. I didn't confront them, not then. Instead, I drove home in silence, the image of their bodies angled toward one another carved into my mind. Lily was at the kitchen table working on her laptop when I walked in. She looked up smiling, but paused when she saw my expression. "Everything okay, Mom?" she asked softly. I kissed the top of her head and said I was just tired. Protecting her from the truth had become second nature, but my chest burned with the weight of it. Days stretched into weeks, each one heavier than the last. I could no longer convince myself that I had misread the signs. Mark's absences grew longer, his excuses thinner, and Tessa's distance from me almost complete. She no longer bothered with the pretense of friendship. Texts went unanswered, invitations stopped, and the laughter we once shared had dissolved into silence. What cut deepest was not just the betrayal of my husband, but of the woman I had trusted like a sister. I began writing in a journal late at night when the house was quiet. At first, the words came haltingly, but soon they spilled onto the page in long lines, recording each detail. I observed his late-night returns, her unexplained absences from community events, the way conversations hushed when I entered a room. I wasn't sure what compelled me to write it down, but the act steadied me, giving shape to the fog of pain that clouded my days. One Saturday morning, Mark mentioned he would be attending a weekend conference. He packed his overnight bag with an almost cheerful efficiency. When he kissed my cheek on the way out, I caught the faintest trace of Jasmine again. I waited until his car disappeared down the street before calling Marcy. Her voice was calm and steady, and she offered something I hadn't expected, a gentle reminder that knowing the truth was not the same as being ready to act on it. I held the phone against my ear long after we hung up, the echo of her words wrapping around me like a thread of strength. That evening, I walked through the house, slowly taking in the family photos on the walls, the worn couch where Lily had spent hours with her books, the kitchen that had once been filled with easy laughter. All of it felt fragile now, suspended between what had been and what I could no longer deny. I stood at the window, staring into the dark street, and whispered to myself the words I had been avoiding. "He's with her." Saying it aloud made my knees weak, but also clearer. When Mark returned Sunday night, I watched him carry his bag upstairs. His voice was light, asking about Lily's weekend, slipping into the same practiced routine. I answered with calmness I didn't feel, keeping my eyes steady on his face. Something inside me had shifted. I no longer looked at him through the haze of hope or denial. I saw him as he was, and the truth was finally undeniable. The silence between us had become a battlefield, each of us moving carefully, pretending not to notice the widening gap. Yet beneath my steady voice and composed face, a current of clarity had begun to form. I could no longer ignore the truth, and I knew soon the walls I had built to contain it would have to come down. Once the truth finally settled into place, I realized that silence would only keep me trapped. if I wanted to preserve my dignity and protect Lily from the fallout, I needed to move carefully, quietly, and with intention. There would be no shouting match across a kitchen table or messy scene in a restaurant. I had seen enough of how public humiliation could backfire on women. My first step had to be small, steady, and invisible to both Mark and Tessa. At school, I began staying later than usual, not because the work demanded it, but because the quiet allowed me to think. In the evenings with the halls empty and the faint hum of the vending machine echoing down the corridor, I opened my notebook and listed everything I knew. Times, places, conversations, the small inconsistencies in Mark's explanations, even the faint perfume I caught on his clothes. Writing it down gave me clarity, and clarity gave me strength. Marcy noticed the change in me. One night, when she saw me still in my office well past sunset, she leaned on the doorway and said softly, "Whatever you're carrying, Elena, it looks heavy. Just remember you don't have to carry it alone." I thanked her, but I wasn't ready to speak everything aloud. What I did know was that I needed allies, not in whispers of sympathy, but in people who understood how to navigate the world Mark moved in. That chance came sooner than I expected. At a fundraiser hosted by the local education foundation, I found myself seated beside Harold Kim, a man who had chaired the board for years. He had always been kind to me, asking about Lily's schoolwork and praising the programs I ran for struggling students. That evening, his eyes lingered on me a little longer than usual. "You seem tired, Elena," he remarked quietly as the conversation swirled around us. I smiled politely, but something in his tone felt more like concern than casual observation. As the evening wore on, I overheard snippets of conversation at the table, mentions of Mark's name, his travel schedule, his projects for the company. Harold leaned closer at one point and said, almost as if he wanted me to hear, "Your husband has been making quite an impression lately. Not always the kind that earns respect." My hand tightened around my glass. I didn't ask what he meant, but the comment lodged itself firmly in my mind. When I returned home that night, Mark was already in bed, his phone face down on the nightstand. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him breathe evenly, and felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. The time for wondering and doubting had passed. I no longer cared to untangle his excuses. What mattered now was preserving my own future and making sure he and Tessa would never see me broken. The next week, I began setting things quietly in order. I gathered important documents, our mortgage papers, bank statements, Lily's college savings account, and stored copies in a locked drawer at work. I scheduled a private appointment with a financial advisor recommended by Marcy's brother. I didn't tell anyone, not even Marcy, what I was preparing for, but each action gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. Mark remained oblivious, caught up in his routine of late meetings and sudden trips. One evening, as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he asked if I'd be attending the upcoming gala hosted by Joanne. I told him yes, my tone smooth, betraying nothing. He smiled absently, then kissed my cheek and left without another word. I stood at the window and watched his car pull away, the faint smell of cologne and perfume still hanging in the hallway. The gala at Joanne's home was crowded with tables draped in linen and the sound of laughter spilling into the night. Mark and Tessa arrived separately but soon found their way to each other's side. I observed them quietly, every gesture confirming what I already knew. Yet instead of despair, I felt a strange steadiness take root. Their carelessness was a gift, one they didn't realize they were giving me. Later that evening, Harold approached me again. "You carry yourself with grace," he said softly, his eyes flicking toward Mark and Tessa across the room. Not everyone could manage that. I thanked him, though my throat tightened. His words reminded me that others saw more than they let on, and that truth has a way of circling back, no matter how hard people try to bury it. When we left the gala that night, Mark chatted about business connections, never noticing the quiet way I studied him. He didn't know that while he was distracted, I was already taking my first steps toward reclaiming myself. Small steps, yes, but ones that mattered. Each one was a quiet refusal to be erased by his choices. Back at home, once he fell asleep, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea. The house was dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I thought of Lily sleeping upstairs, of the life I had worked so hard to build for her, and of the betrayal that now threatened to undo it. For the first time, I no longer felt powerless. The hurt was still sharp, but beneath it ran a steady current of resolve. I knew I couldn't confront Mark and Tessa yet. Timing mattered, and I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me unprepared. But in the silence of that night, with the shadows stretching across my walls, I promised myself that the days of quiet suffering were ending. A new chapter had begun, one where I would move deliberately carefully toward justice, not through anger, but through clarity and proof. And though they did not yet know it, both Mark and Tessa were about to learn how dangerous it can be to underestimate the quiet strength of a woman who has finally stopped pretending. The moment of exposure came not in whispers, but in the bright lights of a crowded room. Joanne's spring gala had drawn nearly everyone from our circle neighbors, colleagues, and the board members who made decisions about funding schools. I arrived in a simple navy dress, steady on the outside, though my pulse raced beneath the surface. I had chosen this evening carefully, knowing Mark and Tessa would both be there, too comfortable in their own arrogance to sense what was coming. They entered separately, but found each other quickly. Their smiles practiced, their shoulders brushing in ways they must have believed went unnoticed. Yet I wasn't the only one watching. I saw glances pass between guests, quiet nods of recognition, the unspoken acknowledgement that something between them had crossed a line. For months, I had held the truth in silence. Tonight, I would no longer need to. During dinner, Harold Kim stood to give remarks about the foundation's work, his voice carrying with calm authority. When he finished, he gestured for Mark to stand, praising his dedication to community partnerships. Mark adjusted his tie and rose, speaking smoothly about loyalty and values. The irony was sharp enough to sting. I sat still, waiting, knowing his words would soon unravel under the weight of his own actions. As the applause faded, Joanne invited everyone into the adjoining room for coffee and dessert. The shift gave me the moment I needed. I stepped forward and spoke clearly, my voice steady. Before we enjoy the evening, I feel compelled to address something that has been quietly damaging more than just a marriage. The room stilled, eyes turning toward me. Mark froze, the practiced ease sliding off his face. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. Instead, I revealed what I had witnessed: the dinners, the lies, the public charade of fidelity that had fooled no one. I spoke not only as Mark's wife, but as a woman who had been betrayed by both her husband and the friend she had trusted as family. Each sentence landed with the quiet weight of fact. Gasps rippled across the room, followed by silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Tessa tried to laugh, her voice high and brittle. "Elena, you must be mistaken." But Harold cut her off, his voice firm. "We've all seen it, Tessa. The only one pretending not to is you." She paled, her eyes darting toward Mark, who stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. For once, he had no performance ready, no easy story to weave. The truth had been spoken aloud, and there was no pulling it back. I turned then, my gaze steady on the people around us. For years, I believed in loyalty, in vows that meant something. But tonight, I refused to carry shame that was never mine. The betrayal belongs to them, not to me. The words were simple, yet they cut through the room with clarity. No anger, no theatrics, just truth laid bare. Mark's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, he muttered something about private matters and tried to leave, but the damage was already done. Guests stepped aside, whispering as he pushed past. Tessa followed quickly, her shoulders hunched, the clack of her heels sharp against the floor. They had entered with smiles. They left under the weight of humiliation they had crafted for themselves. Afterward, people approached me quietly, offering words of support, some simply nodding in acknowledgement. Harold placed a hand on my shoulder and said softly, "You carried yourself with dignity. That's what they'll remember." His words steadied me even as my heart raced from the confrontation. I hadn't planned to seek pity or applause. I had only wanted the truth spoken where lies had lived too long. When I returned home later that night, Lily was waiting up, her textbook spread across the table. She looked at me with questioning eyes, sensing the shift. I sat beside her and took her hand, not giving details, but assuring her that we would face whatever came with honesty. She nodded slowly, her grip tightening around mine. It was enough for now. The house was quiet after she went to bed. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window, the night air pressing cool against the glass. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. The secrecy was over. The lies were no longer mine to hold. Mark and Tessa had been unmasked, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew I had crossed a threshold. The silence of my living room felt different now, not heavy with doubt, but alive with possibility. I could hear my own breath, steady and strong. And I knew this was only the beginning. Their downfall had only just begun, and I was ready to face what came next. In the days after the gala, the ripples spread faster than even I expected. What had been whispered for months was now spoken openly, no longer confined to cautious glances or half-finished sentences. Neighbors avoided Mark on the street, their greetings shortened to curt nods, while invitations that once filled his calendar dried up without explanation. The world he had carefully polished began to dull, not through my hand alone, but through the weight of his own actions, finally laid bare. At work, his phone buzzed constantly, with messages he ignored or silenced with a tight jaw. I overheard fragments when he thought I wasn't listening. Colleagues withdrawing from projects, clients stepping back, partners unwilling to risk association with scandal. He tried to cover the losses with bravado, insisting at the dinner table that business goes through cycles, but even Lily, though quiet, saw through the hollow explanation. Tessa fared no better. Her event planning contracts dwindled almost overnight, brides canceling with thin excuses, corporations withdrawing their reservations. Joanne stopped defending her at gatherings, perhaps too weary or embarrassed to carry the burden. I passed Tessa once at the grocery store, her cart half empty, her shoulders slumped, as if she were carrying something heavier than bags. She turned sharply down another aisle when she saw me, her face pale, her eyes avoiding mine. For years, she had been part of my family's rhythm, and now she skulked through aisles like a stranger who had lost her place. Walter came by one afternoon with a box of tools again, claiming a hinge on the back door needed tightening. He moved slower than usual, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. After a long silence, he looked at me and said, "I don't know what to say, Elena. I raised him better than this." His voice cracked the weight of disappointment, heavier than anger. I rested my hand lightly on his arm and told him gently that some choices belong only to the person who makes them. He nodded, eyes moist, and left without another word. Inside the house, Mark began to unravel. His evenings grew restless, pacing from room to room, pouring drinks he rarely finished. He spoke of loyalty, of betrayal, of people turning on him, as though he were the victim of a grand injustice. I listened in silence, letting his words fall into the empty space between us. I had no need to correct him. The truth already lived outside our walls beyond my voice. One night, he slammed a stack of papers onto the kitchen counter termination of a major account he had cultivated for years. "They're fools," he muttered, though his hands shook as he shoved the documents back into his briefcase. He looked at me then as if expecting sympathy, perhaps even comfort. But I offered none. My eyes stayed steady, my voice calm, and I asked only if he would like some tea. He turned away without answering, shoulders hunched under the weight of a downfall he could no longer disguise. The more he scrambled, the clearer the contrast became in my own life. My work at the school flourished, students leaning on me, colleagues trusting me. Marcy, standing at my side with quiet support. Lily began to smile more often, perhaps sensing that though her father's choices had cracked the foundation, her mother's steadiness would keep the house standing. At night, she would linger in the kitchen, telling me about college plans, her eyes bright with possibility. It reminded me why I had chosen silence for so long to protect her. Now she saw not only the cracks, but also the strength that remained. The community watched too. At board meetings, Harold Kim would greet me warmly, his respect evident, while Mark sat stiff and avoided eye contact. In subtle ways, the balance shifted. Where once Mark commanded attention, now it was granted to me, not because of scandal, but because dignity has a way of shining brighter when chaos surrounds it. As weeks passed, I noticed the change in Mark's face. The confident lines softened into worry, his eyes darting more often, his shoulders rounded as though bracing against blows he could no longer control. He stayed out late, less not from renewed devotion, but because there was no one waiting for him. Tessa had slipped quietly from sight, her name now spoken with pity rather than admiration. Their partnership, built on secrecy and betrayal, had collapsed under its own fragility. I didn't celebrate their losses. I didn't need to. The justice lay not in revenge, but in watching the truth do its quiet work. Their world shrank while mine remained intact, strengthened by honesty and patience. I learned that sometimes the sharpest revenge requires no action beyond standing firm, refusing to be broken, letting others destroy themselves with the choices they once defended so proudly. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, I heard Mark moving heavily upstairs. His footsteps dragged the sound of a man who no longer carried pride. I looked down at the neat stacks of clean clothes, the ordinary rhythms of life still intact, and felt a calm settle over me. Their collapse was nearly complete, but mine had never begun. And though part of me longed for closure, I knew there was one step left before I could truly move forward, one decision that would not only sever the past, but also protect the future I had begun to reclaim. The final step came quietly, without fanfare. I met with an attorney in a small office downtown, the air faintly scented with old books and coffee. Signing the divorce papers felt less like ending a life and more like laying down a weight I had carried far too long. There were no tears, no hesitation, only the steady movement of pen across paper. When I walked back into the sunlight, I breathed easier than I had in years. Mark moved out within weeks, his departure marked not by anger, but by resignation. He returned to his father's house, stripped of the respect he once relied on, and left to face the hollow silence of choices he had made. Tessa, from what I heard through neighbors, had lost nearly all her contracts. Her name whispered more in pity than admiration. Their story had ended not with triumph, but with a slow unraveling that matched the way it began. For Lily, the change was steadier, gentler. She adapted with a resilience that surprised me, focusing on her senior year and planning for college with determination. Sometimes, she would sit across from me at the kitchen table and smile softly, as if to say she understood more than she let on. I realized then that protecting her had never meant hiding the truth. It meant showing her what strength looked like in the face of betrayal. Walter remained kind, stopping by occasionally with small gestures, fresh produce from a neighbor's garden, a newspaper folded under his arm. His disappointment in his son was clear, but he never let it overshadow the respect he showed me. We spoke often about Lily, about the importance of honesty, and about the ways family can wound as deeply as it can heal. His quiet presence reminded me that not every bond had been broken. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my routines not with haste, but with intention. Work became a place of fulfillment again, my students grounding me in the small victories of their growth. At home, I found comfort in ordinary things: the smell of coffee brewing in the morning, the sound of Lily's laughter drifting down the hallway, the feel of warm sunlight across the kitchen floor. These simple moments reminded me that dignity is not restored in grand gestures, but in the quiet reclaiming of everyday life. Looking back, I see now that my revenge was never about destruction. It was about standing tall when others tried to make me small, about letting the truth shine where lies had thrived. Mark and Tessa had lost their standing, their reputations, and their sense of control. I had lost only illusions, and in their place, I gained clarity, peace, and freedom. I learned something I hope Lily carries with her as she steps into her own future: love that is conditional is not love at all. The people who truly belong in your life do not demand you prove your worth, they simply honor it. Betrayal hurts, but it also reveals who we can trust and who we must release. Now, when I sit on the back porch in the evenings listening to the crickets rise with the dusk, I no longer feel haunted. I feel steady, grateful, and unbroken. My life is my own again, shaped not by their betrayal, but by my choice to rise above it. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your reflections in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.